Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Cocktail Hour. This is Beyond Words at the Time of the Writer Festival, coming to you from UKZN in my home city of Durban, which is also the UNESCO City of Literature, by the way. I'm not in Durban, however, nor are my four panelists this evening. Our topic today is dismantling stereotypes through writing, specifically stereotypes around gender, tradition, culture, and race. And since we live in a very multicultural, multiracial society here in South Africa, and our one non-South African panelist is currently an African living in the United Kingdom, in Scotland, I think we've got lots to talk about. We have an esteemed and very distinguished panel here today. I'm going to introduce them very, very briefly because you can read their bios on the Time of the Writer's site, as well as on their individual websites or social media. So joining us today, all the way from Edinburgh, we have Clementine Burnley. She's a writer, a poet, an essayist, a migrant mother. She loves to read, write, and look at and teach the art and craft of writing. I've read several of her pieces and was saying earlier that one of the things I love most about this festival is that every year I get to be introduced to new writers that I hadn't previously heard of. So I'm very, very happy to add her to my writer collection. Welcome, Clementine. Second up on our panel is Razena, Theba, whose debut novel, which is a fictionalized memoir, A House on Vorster Street, has proven a runaway success over the last few months. It is an easy read, and I don't mean that in any way disparagingly. I just love that it's an easy read. It's a funny read. It's set in the Johannesburg suburbs of Fitas and Fordsburg, which many of you will know. Fitas particularly was an area of forced removals by the apartheid government, and therefore it's an evocative part of our natural cultural legacy. Rehana also known as the Barefoot Facilitator, also known as Rehana Moosajee, is a former public servant in the city of Johannesburg, a councillor. She headed the transport portfolio for quite a while. And she's also a prolific writer and life coach and facilitator. She has written contributions to several anthologies, amongst them the Samosa Express and Saffron anthologies. And she's also a mother in her private life. So welcome to you as well, Rehana, and to Razena. And last up on our panel is an author who needs no introduction to the South African literary scene. She's published several novels, amongst them a series of children's works featuring the intrepid heroine Nisa Kamar. She's also published anthologies such as Belly of Fire, contributed to other anthologies, published poetry anthologies, and her debut novel, SoPhia, looked at issues of gender-based violence within a marriage in a Muslim household. She has recently published her second novel, The Economics of Love and Happiness, which explores the theme of human trafficking, both in South Africa and on the continent as a whole. So welcome once again to all of you and to those of you joining us in the audience. Please post your comments in the comments boxes and they will be passed on to us. We're going to allocate at least the last 20 minutes to respond to you and engage with you. So please stay tuned. So right off, before we talk about dismantling stereotypes around gender, race, tradition, and culture in your writing, I'd like to ask each of you for an example from your current milieu of a glaring stereotype around one or more of these things. And can I start with you, going backwards from how I introduced you? Can I start with you, Shafinaaz?
Thank you, Ayesha. As I understand, is it, you're looking for breaking stereotypes from within writing or just from what we've observed around us?
Sorry, just what you've observed around you in your current milieu, not necessarily in your writing. Could be both.
I mean, I think because the research is so fresh with me, there is the stereotype, for example, that women are more highly trafficked through the continent, but we're finding that young boys are often trafficked, for various reasons. And the most vulnerable are from within the rural areas. And this is what I've concentrated on in some of my writings. But there's also, to be noticed, cultural stereotypes that need to be worked on. We think we're in 2022 and we've come through the pandemic, and the pandemic in many ways has highlighted how on a back foot we are in terms of breaking with race and gender stereotypes, social class stereotypes that maybe exacerbate what the pandemic has highlighted. And I think just having a discussion like this is so imperative, because it allows us that opportunity once again, together with an audience, to continue these conversations about creating more egalitarian solutions and breaking those boundaries and smashing stereotypes. We've been talking smashing stereotypes for centuries, but how far we get within the paradigm that we're living in and what we're observing around us really depends on finding sustainable solutions. And discussions like these are a very powerful way of recreating that space to find those solutions.
Thank you so much, Shafinaaz. That's a wonderful introduction, an example not only of a gender stereotype there in the trafficking example, but looking at social stereotypes more generally. Rehana, over to you.
Thanks, Ayesha. I'm really going to pick up on two that have been quite prominent, predominantly through my work in the last couple of months. And the first one is really the kind of split identity that many in the community that I hail from carry. I certainly consider myself South African, but most people who share my lineage and background still refer to themselves, even though they've never been to India, still refer to themselves as Indian. So had an interesting experience a couple of days ago where someone was introducing themselves and said, something about Indian. And I was like, oh, maybe he considers himself Indian. I'm South African. So, that's a big piece. And then I think in a lot of the work that I'm doing internationally, so I think I'm a less prolific writer than many of the other guests, Ayesha. Often I write when kind of someone says, there's an anthology and can you contribute a short story? And then I kind of force myself to sit down and write, and always love it and use writing very much as therapy in my own life, but hardly ever write to publish. But in the work I'm doing, I think it's really the stereotypes around Africa as a continent, its people, and the whole kind of global sentiment of this basket case continent that needs everybody's aid and help. And increasingly, I think people are coming into a sense of we can, in fact, ground our identity as Africa, and we can hold our own against most in the world. Thanks, Ayesha.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Rehana. Those are two stereotypes that bug, excuse my language, the hell out of me as well. So I regard myself as a Pan-Africanist, as I think you know. And yeah, the Africa is the dark continent, the failed continent. Given developmental work, which is the focus of my work the last 2 or 3 decades, in various parts of the continent, I hear that incessantly, and it is not true, but that's a discussion for another day. Razena, over to you now.
Thanks, Ayesha. Thanks for the kind words about my book. I'm not an academic, so I'm going to bring this a little bit closer to home. I am a mother of 2 teenage boys, and I started feeling a responsibility to tell them how I see the world, and that's largely informed by where I come from and how I was raised. And I noticed increasingly in the community in which I live, there are extremes. And I wanted to do something because I thought to myself, Indians are we either doing a Bollywood song and dance, or we are the terrorists, or we don't belong. And I needed something to show the humanity, which I think every community has, but they needed to understand the nuances of different kinds of people. If you put a scarf on your head, you are disempowered, or somebody's controlling you. We need to break those things down so that we can foster understanding.
That's so true, and so important for future generations and for creating social cohesion in the multicultural country and world in which we live. And on that point, the current happenings in Ukraine and in Europe more generally are showing up some of those stereotypes globally as well, and the hypocrisy that exists in the global order at present. So it's a really important one that you brought up there in terms of the kind of head covering equals submissive Muslim woman, Muslim equals terrorist, etc. Thank you for that. And now over to you, Clementine.
So resonating with some of what I've heard already, I was trying to think what two stereotypes I could refer to. And then it occurred to me that there is something really easy, which I have come to after a lot of thought, which is that I don't regard it as my job to deal with other people's ideas of what I or my family or my culture or my community are supposed to be. And so I think for me, one of those things which I find very puzzling is not being allowed to be the person that I am in the moment when I encounter other people. And so I try to be very, very particular and very specific in my writing so that it doesn't represent anybody. I don't speak for Black people. I don't speak for people who come from the West African nation of Cameroon. I don't attempt to engage in some kind of anthropology when I'm writing. Like, I'm not writing to represent anything. And so that's the one thing, perhaps. It is not to engage with anything except the character or the context that I'm writing about. And the second thing is, because I'm writing at the moment a nonfiction book, which is really about my family and the way that I grew up, and trying through that to look at the history of my country, Cameroon, and to understand the kind of amnesia that exists in what we know about our relationships with the European countries that colonized Cameroon, which were France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. But to do that really in a conversation, because I think the kind of cultural destruction which occurred in Cameroon is something which very few people are able to understand. The scale of cultural annihilation which took place over the 200 or 300, 400 years of encounter with the Europeans, it's really unprecedented. So the idea that we don't have a culture, so it's referred to as a tradition, that we don't have high philosophy of governance, and that we don't have literature. It's difficult to believe, but that's a common belief. And so perhaps, yes, if I was going to engage with a stereotype, it would be with that of knowledge production, perhaps. Yeah, thanks for the question.
I love that. I love that you're so adamant about not consciously representing any specific group, culture, tradition, race, nationality, whatever, but also that you speak so potently about what has been done to your country. And I will say that the bits of your writing I have read do seem to me to be the kinds of writing that break down, perhaps subconsciously, stereotypes. Your Peter Rabbity piece, for example, being the outsider in that group. Certainly that's a stereotype. Also the piece you wrote on the Scottish poet, thinking of what his experiences as a Black person in Scotland, 70 years ago, was it, or 50 years ago might have been. So I think that in itself does break down stereotypes, even though you don't consciously set out to do so. So my second question for you all then is, how does one break down stereotypes if one were to do it consciously or even subconsciously, as I've seen Clementine do? How does one do it without becoming lectury, without becoming too didactic? Because that's going to put your audience off. So are there any tools, tips, tricks for actually getting that kind of message across of wanting to show that the stereotypes of what people think we are isn't actually who we are? What's your best tool or trip for doing that? And Razena, can I start with you here? Because again, I think you've done a fantastic job, whether conscious or not, in your book.
Thanks, Ayesha. I'm a little, I'm coming from a slightly different place in writing compared to Clementine. I felt a huge responsibility. I wrote very slowly and I wrote very deliberately about an area that was loved by so many people. And I wanted to get it right. I was terrified of getting it wrong, and particularly because it was a memoir. Yes, it's my life, but I needed to sort of put Fordsburg and fit us into a book. And if you're familiar with those areas, it wasn't an easy thing to do. I think the answer to your question is humanity. I think instead of people being spoken about in the collective, I think when you go into people's lives and you find the empathy and you understand the circumstances around what made them behave in particular ways, that's what I found with my writing. Even characters I didn't like when I started, I ended up understanding. So that's where they come from. For example, that's why it was important to my grandfather that he not have a daughter who was divorced. What did it mean to him? What was it attached to in his life? So in those kinds of ways, I think writing is important because for me, it was healing. And I think it fosters understanding, like you said. And if we can do more of that, we can stop grouping people into bunches, I think.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Razena. A very important stereotype, I think, that you've brought up there. And the stereotype or the kind of stigmas attached to divorce and divorcees, particularly divorced women, still endure, though in different ways. So while your grandfather's notions of that might have been carried over from his Indian roots, some of that has filtered down even to present day societies in South Africa and further afield. So thank you for that. What about you, Rehana? How would you, any tips, tricks, tools?
So Ayesha, I smile because in fact, both my stories, reflect to some extent the piece in writing the Somusa Express is really about women being supported by strong men. But I think in both my stories, I share about divorces, one really young at age 20-something, and then one 23 or 24 years after that with two grown children, and all of the stereotypes that come with that. But I think, for me, my writing is never consciously setting out to break a stereotype. I think, like Razena, it's about telling my story as authentically as I can and understanding that is my perspective on what has happened. I think in some of my pieces, I even qualify that that's what I think might have happened. And I think it is about, just authentically putting myself out there. And hopefully that in itself is enough to break down stereotypes, because I think you don't have to come from the same tradition, same culture to identify. And what's interesting, Ayesha, is when I wrote a letter to my daughter, had no idea where her life journey would take her. And the letter actually says, choose what you want from here. But I mean, she's ended up across continents, living now in Norway, married there. And so, I think for me, my writing is really about processing my own stuff in many ways. And I think when I put it on paper and I read it back, it's just a reminder of it's an ordinary life, but there's a story there.
Well, I would say an ordinary life with some extraordinary elements, Rehana, just because I do know you. Now, I find it interesting that, both you and Razena have similar views on that, because both of you are doing or have done life writing, memoir style, whereas Clementine and Shafinaaz don't write memoir, or, well, Shafinaaz has that I know of, possibly Clementine has as well, but what I've read more of from the two of you is third person writing, as it were, or writing fiction, not about your own life or not necessarily based on your own life. So Clementine, over to you on that one. Any tips, tricks, tools for making that dismantling of stereotypes natural, less lectury, not didactic?
I started off as a researcher, and so I wrote academic texts. I wrote policy reports as well. These were factual. A lot of them were about migration and climate change. And so I understand how to present facts, but what I realize is when people read in their free time, they want to engage with more than facts. I think that even in my fiction, I hope that there is truth in what I write. But I think the tip that I have found useful is to allow the writing to develop the way that it is going to anyway, despite what I might think when I first start to write. So I don't have a preconceived idea anymore of how it's going to turn out. And I try to respect the development of the story, the development of the character, who very often has a different idea of what they are going to be than the one that I think should be there on the page. So I like to let the writer see, the reader see me grappling with whatever it is that is happening. I think in that way, I write about people and I write about their lives and their contexts. And the question of stereotype, how does that then interact? I think if there is a stereotype in the reader's head, that's not going to be touched by reading what I've written. I really am a writer who believes in reader responsibility. And I'm not a writer who thinks that through reading, the concrete material problems of the world will be solved. Yeah, I think we have to be a little careful about that, because people who have concrete material problems very rarely end up being either writers or readers. And so they're somewhat excluded from the conversation.
Okay, a really interesting perspective there. Thank you, Clementine. I too come from an academic background, so I grapple with some of these questions myself in fiction writing. But again, I think, what you've said about writing about people talks to what both Rehana and Razena have said about bringing out the characters' humanity. And I love the fact that your characters take on a life of their own. I think every writer has that experience of, she's not doing what I thought she would do, and it's such an aha moment for a writer to come to that and sort of find that the characters have really developed, grown beyond the sort of maybe the cardboard you cut out, you started off with initially. Shafinaaz, your take on this question, please.
So I was considering, just to appreciate what the other writers have said on the panel, is it's so beautiful to have that opportunity and space to interrogate your sort of role as a writer in bringing out these characters and in formulating the story that that you're writing, whether it's in the form of memoir. I think it takes huge courage to write memoir. So congratulations on successfully accomplishing that, Razena, and to some degree Rehana's work as well. And it's a little more of a cop-out to write fiction, I think, because you can hide behind that. When I look at my journey started out very sort of as a trained sociologist. Writing Daughters Are Diamonds was about breaking stereotypes, especially, back in 2003 when I wrote it as the manuscript for my sociology master's. It was all about fact-finding and observing and reporting on these facts. And it was also about a young person observing what was happening around me, but writing for a Western audience to say, Muslim women are not oppressed. Egalitarian reading of the Quran, changes your perspective when you understand how rights and responsibilities are embedded in various of the cultural texts. So the original writing was very much deliberate about, breaking down stereotypes and then expanding from there in the form of short stories and fiction. I used fiction to unpack and sort of burn open, those heavy kind of details around what it means to be educated, what it means to be married, what it means to be divorced, what it means to be a single unmarried woman in today's society, and also the autonomy that women have once they cross the threshold of their home, as opposed to living in a democratic space that allows, that makes so many allowances. So those kinds of, this was the interplay between the public and the private life that I interrogated. Novels have allowed me far wider scope to be able to do that, whether we're talking about domestic violence in a Muslim home, or we're talking about human trafficking and cross-cultural and cross-racial marriages. And then, of course, I've been able to have huge fun with the Nisa series for young adults. But what it's done is it's allowed me to, firstly, my work is not plot-driven, it's very much character-driven. And it's allowed me to get into the sort of the thinking and the body of these characters and work around those observed stereotypes, those encountered stereotypes, and sort of kind of, it's not as forceful as report writing. It's not saying this is what you're doing as a society, get over yourself, but it is about saying, what if this is what we're doing? What if the story is similar to what I'm seeing around me? And somehow breaking stereotypes does take a little bit of a gentle but forceful approach, and fiction allows that. Fiction allows that bridge. I think Razena mentioned earlier, about creating those windows and those bridges. I'm sort of paraphrasing, but it does allow you that window, and that's a sort of gentle approach to smashing, undoing those stereotypes.
So combining the forceful with the gentle approach, sort of deciding when to be forceful about something or when to present it in a gentler way. Thank you, Shafinaaz. I'm going to read some of the comments coming up now. I still have a couple of questions for you guys, but I'd like for us to engage with the audience as well. So I'm going to read some of the comments out. Some are directed specifically at one or the other of you. The others are general, but feel free to answer any or all or some of them. So there's a comment here from Pralini Naidu: we can never represent a community, a race, or an ethnicity. Those were made up by those in power, the colonial legacy. Thanks, Clementine. We are more than. And I think that phrase is so powerful, Pralini. Thank you. We are more than. A comment from Jerry Wadja: I like the question, how do we break down stereotypes? Thank you. A comment again from Pralini: our authentic voices break the stereotypes. So again, agreeing with what all four of you have been saying about presenting people, presenting humanity, using anecdotes and the bridges that link people to actually crush those stereotypes, whether consciously or subconsciously. Nazima Sumar Adam says, agree, Razena, it's judgment without speaking and understanding that is destroying society. And a comment from Susie Bernstein: what Clementine says about Cameroon is interesting. Susie says she's visited there. So as a visitor to the country, I could feel the absence of that knowledge. I presume she's talking about the absence of the knowledge of the cultural heritage that was eradicated, obliterated by waves of colonials. And on that note, I find it interesting, Clementine, that you write both in English and German, I believe. I'm not sure about French, but you can tell us about that when we come to you now. Another comment here from Joanne Hitchens: humanity is a common factor, that works for me, more agreement there. And another comment from Jerry Wadja: an ordinary life with a story is important in raising concerns. It is the ordinary life that is most burdened by stereotypes. And then a comment from Janine Pretorius: I find it rather conflicting between consciously breaking down stereotypes and simply living without having to constantly explain or justify ourselves and our experiences. Being that kind of bastion can be exhausting, a paradox of sorts. I really empathize with that, Janine. And another comment from Pralini: inspiring, Clementine, solutioning leaves little space for magic. And on that note of magic, we then go to another comment, yet another one. Nasima Bulbulia saying, no story is ordinary. I think in response to you, Rehana, certainly an extraordinary life, as I've said. And Farah says, again, aimed at Clementine: thank you, Clementine, a wonderful point about reader responsibility and letting the reader see what you're grappling with. We're all vulnerable and carry a collective responsibility towards finding healing solutions. Reader responsibility opens the possibility of shared collective responsibility in dismantling histories of harm. So some really engaged and thoughtful and thought-provoking comments there. And I'm just going to do a round of you guys again. Feel free to respond to any, to all, to some of those, but trying to weave it into your own work as well. And here I'm going to start off with Clementine, please, because many of them were directed at you.
I think that those comments illustrate really the kind of conversation that I'm always hoping, sitting at my desk, crossing out the 16th draft of one paragraph that I thought was going to take half an hour and has turned out to take more than a day. It's exactly that kind of conversation that I'm hoping is going on in the reader's head, you know, because the reader is bringing they're bringing themselves to what I'm writing. They're bringing all their experiences, all their history. And so I'm thrilled because that turns writing into a conversation. You see, I think it's rather poor that we have words on paper and we don't really get to see the readers grapple the way that I grapple when I read somebody's work. I'm like with that writer for the entire time that and for a long time afterwards also. The characters and the images are going through my head. So I just think, yeah, the reader is out there. And if we want to break down stereotypes, that's work that is shared. And I think we need magic because I get so tired, You know, I get so tired. The idea of serving as the Encyclopedia Britannica of Black people is not my my idea of fun. I'm not an explainer.
So you're not the equivalent of mansplaining for Cameroon. We get that very, very clearly. Thank you, Clementine. You know, while you were talking about that magic and that dialogue between reader and writer and seeing what the writer is grappling with, I had essentially that conversation in my head. I have it with a few writers, but particularly when I read Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other, I kept asking, but why did you write it like that? And what's this supposed to mean? And, you know, I wished you were there to have that conversation with, quite frankly. So thank you for bringing that up, that dialogue with the writer that we as readers actually do start to have. Rehana, response to any of the comments, any or all?
Now, I'm really intrigued more, you know, thanks for the comments, but really intrigued by this notion in the way Clementine has raised it around reader responsibility. And I mean, I think from, you know, when you write, you have no idea really into whose hands that piece will fall and what it would mean to them at a particular point in time. But I mean, I've been particularly struck, and I think with Razena's writing, Ayesha, when I read Razena's book, my brother actually brought it along, Razena, and said, you know, I think you're going to enjoy this. And I actually, like, literally, I think in one day I had a free day and just kind of sat in the garden and read it. But really struck by, you know, as a young child, learning how to read at school, being unable to identify with the Roys and Carols that we were reading about. And suddenly, I think a whole range of people writing about spaces, sounds, smells, things that just feel so familiar, has been such a delight from a reading perspective and a reader perspective to actually be able to see a world that you grew up in being represented and jumping into life through these words on paper is, you know, for me, it's been wonderful. And I think there've been a number of writers in the last couple of years who really have been kind of taking the ordinary and elevating it into something that others can draw from. And for me, that's, you know, Shafinaaz, Your Daughters Are Diamonds, you know, I think I read very soon after it was published, and just like the title in itself, you know, jumping out at me. So yeah, I'm just very intrigued by this notion of the interface between the reader who you never know and the writer who you may never meet, but this meeting that happens through these words.
Absolutely agree with you there, Rehana. I think, you know, turning the ordinary into something you can have a conversation with, but not only having a conversation with, and Ismail Mohammed, the director of this festival, says on Facebook, turns writing into a conversation. I love that. So thanks for that, Ismail. Yes, I love it too. But also that's where the magic happens, where the supposedly ordinary life that somebody has put down there for you to explore on paper or on your screen, if you're reading on screen, suddenly has such resonance with your own experiences, your own milieu, your own setting. You recognize things, events, smells, tastes, as you've said, and it starts to break down again those barriers that stereotyping causes without us even meaning to do that. Since Rehana's been talking specifically to your books, Shafinaaz and then Razena, I'm going to come to Shafinaaz now and then end this round with Razena, if that's okay. Shafinaaz?
It's fine. I'm just looking at this this comment about breaking down stereotypes and the exhaustion of it. Invariably, our expression of living there's something extraordinary about the ordinary. And so when we put that down into text as writers, obviously there's various ways of breaking stereotype, but the opportunity that we have as writers is simply to sometimes put down what's observed and what's felt around us. And you just become a medium for generating that conversation that can change consciousness, alter consciousness, or invariably find solutions through that ongoing conversation. And our writing really just forms that ongoing conversation with whoever else is writing. There have been, thousands of books written in the thousands of years before us, and there will continue to be. And I hope that there's a lot more writing, especially in the form of authentic memoir, that allows us social documentation that is reflective, that is authentic, and that is just raw and honest, because that's where we can actually find the material we need to sit down, to sift down, and find that extraordinary in the ordinary, and obviously to change the sort of this idea that we are bound by stereotype, or we're bound by certain limitations based on those stereotypes, and forge new ways forward. And I see that in the next generation, who are not as tied down by some of these conditional arrangements that we so easily kind of played with in our time. So I see writing as that opportunity to change the dynamic.
Thank you, Shafinaaz. I agree with you entirely, though I will take issue with in our time. You're sounding as though you're Methuselah there, and I know you're not. But also, I'd like to say, much as I appreciate what you said about life writing and memoir writing, and as you know, I'm currently undergoing that process myself. I also think I'll take issue with what you've said about novel writing being a cop-out or being easier. It's not. You would never have engaged with the issue of human trafficking, for example, if you were doing memoir or life writing. So it takes an enormous amount of research. I know this from doing academic writing, to be able to write cogently about something as important and yet as sensitive in a way as human trafficking. So thank you for the kinds of work you've done as well. Razena, over to you in response to the comments that have come up so far.
I suppose anecdotally, I was invited to a school to talk about the memoir, and one of the young learners put her hand up and said to me, "Is writing a good job for a woman?" And I was stuck. I was completely and utterly stuck. The teacher looked at me a little bit nervously. "What are you going to say to her?" I believe that anyone can write, and I think that everyone should write. And it was the fabulous Karabo Kholeng who said to me, and this has been said in many different ways, that if we don't write, others will write it for us, and men will write it for us, So it was important to get all of this down. Just in terms of reader responsibility, I'd say that it is entirely up to the reader what they want to take away from this. I've had people tell me the memoir was funny. I've had people tell me it was so sad. It was so sad. We cried the whole way through. And some people have said to me, "I feel so sorry for you. What a sad life you've lived," So I think the reader comes to the book with whatever they want to take from it, and that's fine with me.
Thank you, Razena. You probably saw me laughing there, muted though I was. I thought your book was very funny in parts. I also did think it was very poignant in parts. So, as you said, reader responsibility and what they take away from it. Janine Pretorius says, "I'm really comforted by this notion of embracing the grappling that is emerging from this conversation." So am I, Janine. So am I, really, because I am grappling at the moment. So thank you for that comment. I mentioned just now that, that for me, Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other was one of those books that kind of made me go into a conversation with the writer, even if it's just in my own head. But the other thing I found in reading is that sometimes we're not aware of the biases, the stereotypes we ourselves hold, even as writers, even as academics, even as researchers. And there are certain works or scenes in certain works, be it a book, a play, a piece of nonfiction, even a piece of poetry, that give you that aha moment that actually switches your own bias. I don't know if any others of you have had this experience, and whether you'd like to talk to it, that kind of addresses or puts your own bias in front of you in such a way that you're forced to confront it as a stereotype, as a bias. So I'm going to leave this one open to anybody who wants to jump into it. And I'm muting myself.
So Ayesha, I think the book that challenged me in that way was I Dared to Call Him Father, which is kind of the story of a conversion and reversion out of Islam. And it's, I mean, it's something that I've often thought about, the kind of joy that there is in the community when somebody embraces Islam and what that feels like, but often asked, like, would we respond and react in the same way if someone we loved kind of decided to leave the fold? And I think that book challenged me in many ways, around, yes, you say, and I suppose even, you know, when my daughter took this decision to get married in another culture and so forth, she was like, but you brought us up to respect. And I was like, yes, respect everyone. I just didn't expect you to make this your life choice, you know? So yeah, I think, you know, in theory, a lot of these things, one can feel a particular way, but when you're confronted around things that you hold quite close, you are challenged. So certainly that was one that challenged me.
Thank you, Rehana. That's certainly a really poignant example. And thank you for sharing the anecdote from your own life as well. Clementine, I'm going to address this to you now, because in the one piece of yours that I read, killing the hummingbird, I think, or to kill the humming, I can't remember exactly what it was called. Forgive me, I have a horrible memory. But you do address the issue of your own, perhaps insidious homophobia in it to some extent, don't you? Or am I reading too much into that?
Oh, well, you see, these are the dangers of confusing fiction with fact. I myself have forgotten the name of that particular piece, but there's hummingbird in the title as well. Isn't that odd? In that, I grapple with a character who doesn't realize that the way that they think about another person holds the seed of harm to that person. Yeah. And that's what I meant about grappling not being having the right answer to a moral question, but allowing the question to stand there on the page and for the reader to deal with that. The fact that I think that there are no laws that can be made by the writer that will change the material world in which we live, in which people are harmed by homophobia all the time and we don't do anything about it. So that was my position, really, was to have a character whom the reader could imagine themselves being, and to see what responsibility we each have to deal with the consequences of our lack of knowledge and lack of empathy impacting on other people's ability to survive. Yeah, because for me, this is a really serious thing. And this is why I like to distance myself from literary conversation, which remains in safe, abstract spaces where everybody is well off and kind of muses on those odd people over there to whom terrible things happen and who say and do terrible things. So really, this is what that I was trying to do in this piece, and that's what I try to do in all my writing, is to inhabit the character and to let that character be uncomfortable.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really, really powerful. For me, you know, being able, you as a writer, being able to inhabit that character and exhibit the harm that came from that character's mindset, moral view of the world, or whatever it was, really resonated with me, because I've seen that kind of harm so often. And also your comment about us really, as readers, engaging with our own ignorance. And we're all ignorant and we all lack knowledge about many, many, many things. And being forced to confront that and acknowledge that and face how we would deal with similar situations, or how we might deal more empathetically with similar situations, is, I think, the real conversation between the writer and the reader. Shafinaaz, any comment?
Ayesha, I didn't get some of that sound. I'm really sorry.
I was basically saying, you know, has there been any aha moment for you when reading something or watching something, even, you know, whether play, film, because it's literature, it kind of crosses those boundaries, where you were forced to confront your own biases, the stereotypes you hold, even though you might not actually have concretely thought about them?
I can think of the new novel by Futhi Nshingila. It's called They Got to You Too. And it's about this apartheid cop who ends up in his later life in a nursing home, and he's nursed by you know, a young sort of very revolutionary thinker, a nurse who gives a lot of her time. But he's kind of, you know, he kind of uses her as a soundboard, as he treats her like a younger daughter, and reveals a lot of his regret, you know, for his role, for his own prejudices, and he brings up some of his prejudices, but he sort of grapples with them very interestingly. I think that was quite an eye-opener for me to read. Because you know, it's one thing to enjoy getting into the mind of a character as a reader as well, but just being able to sort of bring the mirror up to my own face and say, well, there were certain stereotypes that I'd assumed when I began reading this book, and they were definitely challenged. In that, Futhi does it very beautifully, very consciously, and very sort of very graciously as well. You know, she sees the human in the character, no matter how flawed they may be, and that's a very beautiful talent to have as a writer. She's got a lot of empathy in the way she presents her characters.
Absolutely, I remember chatting to her about it, and listening to several interviews with her as well. And the common question there, through all those interviews, was, but how do you, as a relatively young Black woman, get into the mind of this apartheid era security person, you know, who's done horrible things in the name of upholding a really unjust and biased regime, and her humility and grace, as you say, Shafinaaz, is truly astounding. Razena, any thoughts from you on that one before I go to the last few comments?
Okay. Quickly, I read Joanne Joseph's Children of Sugarcane recently. And I was embarrassed to say it's a part of our history I was completely unaware of. It was spoken about in our history books, again, like so many things. A little paragraph, a group of people referred to without a story attached to it. So I think in many respects that got me thinking about how much more I'm unaware of. I think we gloss over our history in very broad strokes. And I think when it's done in the way of storytelling and there are people and there are names attached, for me, that's when a story resonates.
Absolutely. For me as well, it's when it resonates. So thank you for that. And Joanne's book, again, breaks down so many stereotypes from 19th century India to 21st century South Africa, and with kind of ripple effects, I think, throughout the globe, frankly. So really, really a beautiful read, even if you're not familiar with the context of it. There are a couple of questions, comments here. I'm just trying to get them. So there's a comment from Ibrahim Fakir on YouTube. Words acquire meaning through representing thoughts. And so writing has to represent ideas and thoughts based on them. But if you write experiences in inverted commas, then, oops, I don't know why I suddenly lost that. Can anybody else see that comment? I've lost the end of it for some reason.
The last comment, it says, how do they refresh and carry on?
No, I think that's a different comment.
So the one from Ibrahim carries on to say, but if you write experiences, then ultimately you reference or debunk a stereotype. And then there's a very specific question from Dr. Nkula Mazivoko Msimang about how writers actually refresh themselves.
So please read out the question, Rehana. I seem to have a frozen chat box.
Okay, it says, how do the writers stay on course when exhaustion and confusion sets in? How do they refresh and carry on?
Very interesting one to end off on. And we're running out of time. We've literally got a couple of, I think, a minute or so. But maybe something to leave all of you with, because I've just been told we have to wrap up. So how does one refresh and carry on? Maybe something to address in your future writing. Thank you all for your contributions here today, for a very rich and absorbing and fascinatingly deep conversation. And thank you to Time of the Writer and all the people, Sibahle, Wesley, Ishmael, your entire team, the fantastic interns you've got in that, as I said, UNESCO City of Literature down in Durban. And thank you for having such a wonderfully curated, beautifully presented, well-organized festival. Thank you, Razena, Clementine, Rehana, and Shafinaaz. It's been a lovely, fun, engaging hour. Hope to see you all soon.
Thanks, Ayesha.
Thank you, Ayesha.